we have heard today in the policy forum today a lot of very, very important initiatives that are being taken by the government of India. We heard very interesting visions from the Saudi Arabian Minister of Labor. We also heard about the private sector and what the private sector thinks that should be done and can be done in the world of jobs. The challenge, of course, is changing and adapting all of this into practice. The vision that Dr. Sahu and others laid out is right. I am certain that the vision that would be laid out by our panelists will also be right. The vision is right. How do we get there? That's really what policymaking is all about, isn't it? So in the closing panel, that's what we'd like to struggle with. And I've promised the panelists actually to do this fairly with a light touch. I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question to just sort of spark the discussion. So I'll go to each one in turn. But after that, and that should take no more than 5 minutes each, hopefully about 3 minutes each. But after that, I would really like this to be a conversation. This is not you as part of the audience sitting back and absorbing the wisdom of all the distinguished panelists that we have here. And yes, please come up. Are you all these distinguished people here who are always wanted in the classroom, the first row is always empty. So it's asking the question, those on the back. Right. Actually, that's good. I used to be a professor, so I have no problems if no one's asking questions to say, yes, do you have a question over there? No, but seriously, let me, all joking aside, give a very warm welcome to our distinguished panel. We are very fortunate to have them with us. Starting from your right, we have Mr. Pranav Sen, who is very well known in Indian policymaking circles and has held a number of very senior positions in the Indian policymaking sphere. Currently, he is a principal advisor to the Planning Commission, but he is also in a role that I may ask him to reflect on, being the chief statistician of India. And that's something that I think is a very important part of the issues that we haven't fully discussed. To his right is Professor Ashwini Deshpande at the Delhi School of Economics. Again, Professor Deshpande has had a very, very long and distinguished career, but she's written most importantly on issues that, again, in these 2 days we have only touched peripherally, which is questions of inequality, of exclusion, and of access to the labor market, and that's really one of the roles that we would like her to play in this panel. Klaus Zimmermann needs little introduction either. He is, of course, the director of IZA, which is the sponsor of this conference together with the World Bank, but Klaus is one of the leading European thinkers on the issues of labor markets, and especially has written a lot of influential work thinking about the German experience and how it may or may not apply, among thousands of other interventions on various issues. But this is the aspect that we will focus on a bit today. And last but not least, Stefano Scarpetta. Stefano is currently leading the labor work at the OECD, but he's also, in his role as ISA, has been one of the two organizers and thinkers behind this conference. So we will ask you, probably not in the conference role, but in your role as one of the thinkers about the broad labor market issues in industrialist countries, how to address this. So with that brief introduction, let me actually just set the stage a little bit. And I'll take no more than a couple of minutes just to throw the extent of the problem we are facing. And some of these numbers I want to throw out from recent work by the World Bank have not been fully absorbed. So this is just to spice up the pot since we are in India. Just for India, the population by 2025 who are between the ages of 15 to 34 is going to be around 450 million. 2025, 450 million people in the working age population 15 to 34. It's a 12% growth between today and 2025. So this is essentially India will be having the same number of young people as Sub-Saharan Africa, many, many, many more than China, who will have about 300 million at that time, and 44% currently of people in that age group are in agriculture. So 4 out of 10, more than 4 out of 10 of these young people today are in agriculture. And finally, one last thing to throw out something that we haven't discussed very much today. Of this population, only about 3% are unemployed. Right? Only 3% of this 15 to 34% population today are unemployed. Another 30% are employed. That's a third. Unemployed and employed are a third. Who are the other thirds? And really you can divide it up by third for South Asia. These are figures for South Asia, not India, but they correspond. Another third are in education. So they are actually in school. And what's left? 1/3 are NEETs, neither in employment, education, or training. 1/3 of young people in South Asia today are idle. So that is the challenge. It is not just the sorts of things we've been talking about in terms of the skills mismatch and how to meet this demand. What do we do with these young people? With that, Stefano, I'll toss out the question to you. Having said all that, obviously, this youth employment issue is not a problem just for India or for any other countries. It's a problem everywhere in the world. In the continent where you work, in the continent where you are from, in the country where you're from, this is a huge issue. And European governments and OECD governments more broadly, the ones you work with, have been taking a lot of measures to deal with this issue of youth employment. Any of those relevant for us, or are these absolutely two different worlds where the policies that have worked or have not worked in OECD countries have no lessons for India or South Asia?
Thank you, Arup, and good afternoon. Let me make a few telegraphic points here. The first one, and I fully agree with Arup, I think youth employment is a global issue. It's not an issue in India, it's not an issue in South Asia, it's an issue in most countries of the world. Of course, the characteristics, the problems, the potential solutions are different, but there is an issue in many countries how to give access to productive, rewarding, career progress, jobs to young people. You mentioned some of the numbers. Out of the global recession, many European countries, especially in the south of Europe, are facing a huge problem of youth unemployment. Just a few numbers that you might be aware of. The youth unemployment in Spain, in Greece, is above 50%, 50. So 1 in 2 young people in the labor market is unemployed. The same, I think, in South Africa, was actually reaching 60%. The point that Arup made, which is a very good one, is that many young people in many countries have simply given up looking for a job. They're not involved in educational training. They're not in the labor market looking for a job. They're simply idle. And that's, in my view, is one of the major social problems we are facing in many countries. In the OECD countries, the advanced countries, the NEET rate is about 16%. In my country, in Italy, is 22%. So almost more than 1 in 5 young people in Italy is idle. He's not studying, he's not looking for a job, he's not employed. Now, I can go as far as saying that at least in some countries, there are huge differences across the board, where in advanced countries, developing countries, emerging economies, but in countries where we have this kind of numbers, we are failing our social contract. Remind ourselves that this is the most educated young generation entering the labor market, the most educated we ever had, and we are not giving them the opportunities, we are not giving them the aspiration that they've been growing up and they're investing in their human capital. Now, from an international organization, then you move on and say, well, we need a comprehensive action on different fronts. That's very easy to say, much more difficult to put in practice because political capital is limited, resources are limited, and so on and so forth. Let me say a few points there. I think you have to start early on. I think there is plenty of evidence to suggest that early childhood is fundamental for cognitive and non-cognitive skill that then will help the young people build their education and actually use the human capital into the labor market. So access to early childhood, access to primary education is fundamental. And of course, in a country like India, other countries, developing countries, there is still an issue about not only access to education, but also the quality of education for girls and for boys. So that's, I think, is very important. But of course, you have to continue this investment into primary and secondary education. Here, another message. And I think to some extent from what I heard over the past 2 days and even this morning, a number of countries have made a big mistake. They have disinvested in technical vocational education. The idea was, in Europe and elsewhere, that we are moving to a knowledge economy, and for a knowledge economy you have to build stronger general skills and competences that then will lead to possibly people reaching tertiary education and then becoming specialized, but with a very strong general educational background. And we have disinvested in many countries on technical vocational education. Guess what? If you look at the skill mismatch, some of the missing skills are precisely in occupation of vocational nature. And now a number of countries are reconsidering the investment in good, high-quality vocational education because I think our economies, our society needs a variety of skills that go from very top level of skills that you can only acquire through tertiary education with also skills that you can better acquire into vocational and technical education. Let's move one step further. And I think we have discussed that in the previous session, guidance and monitoring. As you know, across the board, it's amazing what is the level of skill mismatch, especially among young people. You're talking about numbers in the order of 30 or 40% of young people that have a job, got a job, that actually have skills which are way above what the job they are performing actually command. So guidance and mentoring on the choice of fields of study, I think it's important. Let's dispel another myth. In many countries, the problem is that the way in which we have basically, as a parents, and when we were younger as students, you do your best in school, you invest in your human capital, then one day you finish your school, you get your diploma, you enter into the labor market, and you find a job. Some of us, a bit older, indeed work in this environment. When we finish our study, if we manage to get a good degree with a good score, we could find a job. We could actually choose among different jobs. Now, it's no longer like that. And I think the countries that are doing better on the youth labor market are those countries where there is a lot of interaction between studying in classroom and learning on the job in two ways. I think Klaus can say much more and much more articulated on the German model, so through vocational education and the dual apprenticeship schemes in which you learn on the job and you learn in classroom. Other countries have adopted a more informal approach. They have promoted part-time employment among people still in education. My country, only 10%, Italy, 10% of young people, 20 to 24, that are still studying, get some experience on the job. What the market needs are soft skills, not only sort of strong competence, cognitive skills. And you learn the soft skills much better on the job than in a classroom. And I think, again, effort to promote, to facilitate the acquisition of this soft skill to a closer interaction between learning on the job and learning in school, I think, in my view, is important. Let's move one step further. I think we need a labor demand. We need demand for young people. Now, this is, I think, it's very important. We have discussed a lot about the plateau, what the labor market regulation, and so on and so forth. Let me say one point there. In each and every market economy, there is a lot of flexibility. I don't know of any country in which there is not a lot of mobility, a lot of jobs being created, a lot of jobs being destroyed, a lot of people moving from one job to the other. The issue is not flexibility, yes, flexibility, no. In my view, the issue is what kind of flexibility do we have? In a number of countries, again, referring more to the advanced OECD countries, flexibility in the labor market has been achieved by creating a two-tier labor market. A labor market in which there is a huge amount of flexibility among second-tier type of contract, temporary contract, part-time, jobs on demand, and whatever you want. Guess what? Most of the young people are involved in this activity. For many of even high-skilled young people, the first entry job is this kind of a typical precarious job. This is not a problem. The problem is when actually it's very difficult to move from that job into a more stable, progress jobs. So I think we have to really think about regulation, not because we are against or in favor of flexibility, but because we want to give better job opportunity for young people. Thank you.
Great, Stefano. So you've given your fellow panelists a lot to chew upon, but also I think that was a really helpful laying out of the issues in terms of what the learning is from the OECD countries is. I'll also come back to you maybe later about the failures that we should learn from. Surely they're not only successes and good practice. Professor Deshpande, let me turn to you next. And have you talk a bit about the other side of the spectrum, right? The people who I said, the 43% who are in agriculture, another large majority who are in some ways at the bottom of the skills distribution and don't have access to many of the sorts of jobs that we are talking about. What are the sorts of policies that we should address with them? And in particular, I wanted to press you on a very interesting article by you that I read recently, where you found that affirmative action policies in the Indian railways did not greatly affect the productivity of Indian railways, contrary to what we would have thought. I wanted to say, as an Indian, it's hard to imagine how the productivity of Indian railways would go down anymore. but that's a different matter that we can discuss. But on a serious note, is affirmative action part of the solution, do you think?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked me that question, because one of the themes that, as you said earlier, didn't get sufficiently addressed in the conference was this issue of group exclusion. And I think what affirmative action designs to correct is precisely that issue. So let me actually first answer the railways question, and then I'll get to the broader affirmative action. So what my paper finds is that if you look at non-affirmative action beneficiaries, those who get in through the general quota, and the quota employees. So the variation in the proportion of quota employees in railway zones, and I do it across 23 years, across 8 railway zones, and Indian Railways, as you might know, is the largest public sector employer. And so what I find is that for a period of 23 years across 8 railway zones, the productivity of quota beneficiaries is not any less than the productivity of the general non-quota hires. This is despite the fact that at the point of entry, the eligibility, the cutoff for quota beneficiaries is lower. And that is supposed to be the reason why they are expected to lower productivity. But I think, as was said a little while ago by Stefano, a lot of learning actually takes place on the job. So even if they enter with a 5% lower score in the entrance exam, there's no reason to believe that they'll actually perform worse on the job. And I know that this study is actually the first and so far the only empirical large-scale study of the productivity effect of affirmative action in India. There are studies elsewhere, but not in India. And so I think what the study, so I agree with you that the problems of Indian Railways are many, but all I'm saying is that the SC/ST employees or the quota employees are not responsible for them. So I think that's about the Indian Railways. Coming now to the affirmative action policies in general, I think we need to understand what they are designed to achieve. And when we evaluate affirmative action, we need to first keep in mind what they're designed to achieve and then evaluate them accordingly. So my view about affirmative action, that it's a policy to desegregate the elite. So it's designed towards elite positions, yes. That's the way it is meant to be. And the idea, I think, and which I support, is to make the elite composition of any country more reflecting the underlying social composition. And when I mean social composition, I mean all kinds of groups, whether it's caste groups, religious group, gender, linguistic groups, etc. Because if you didn't do that, then there would be a lot of discontent brewing on the ground, because you always see these elite positions as being manned is actually the word, but it's politically incorrect, it's occupied. Okay. So you see elite positions being occupied by members of certain elite groups. And that leads to a lot of discontent on the ground. And the best example of what can happen when that happens is our northern neighbor, Nepal, whose social composition actually mirrors that of India, but which did not have an affirmative action policy until recently. And there was always reluctance in Nepal to talk about caste because it exists everywhere. In fact, their labor force data are available by individual jati, something that we don't have. So at one level, there's an open acceptance of the caste system. But if you said that untouchables in Nepal or lower caste in Nepal deserve some kind of an affirmative action, the Brahmins and the Kshatris in Nepal would accuse you of being casteist. So when you raise and I have faced this personally, so when I raised the issue of untouchability and the economic outcomes of untouchables in Nepal, I was told to leave because they said that you're making a casteist speech. So the outcomes are actually casteist, not the remedies. And so I think that's what affirmative action, so having said that, I think what we need to remember is affirmative action does not create new employment. It only changes the composition of existing employment. And so affirmative action cannot be faulted for not creating new employment because it was not designed to do so. So what are the forces that create new employment? What are the sources of good jobs, etc.? Those are larger questions, and I'm in full agreement with a lot of what I heard in the conference. But given that those good jobs will be created, hopefully, the point is that all social groups should have representative access to those elite positions. So it's not an anti-poverty program. It's not an employment generation program. It's basically a desegregation of the elite program.
Right. Great. So what we're talking about is actually very important. We've talked about access till this intervention, about actually inclusion in a different way, right? That there is a growing pie, and we want to make sure that all parts of society go equal into a growing pie. The affirmative action philosophy behind it, if I understand you right, in this context, is that in itself is insufficient to have the distribution of jobs that are representative of society. And a second pillar of that saying that we therefore need to change the distribution of who has access to these jobs for social reasons, and that, at least in this particular case, that there are no productivity effects because the initial endowments are not as determinant of productivity as the on-the-job work. So that, in some ways, is a thesis. So we'll try and get to that because I'm sure there'll be interesting challenges to this hypothesis. Klaus, can I turn to you? Not initially to challenge, maybe you can save that for the next round, but just to give some of your perspective on something that has been already raised, indicated by Stefano with the invitation for you to expand upon it. You've talked, and including in yesterday's panel, about the real success and demonstrated success of the sort of vocational training programs in the German context. That has really led to a specific type of generation of jobs with a collaboration between the public and private sector that is seen by most observers, if not all, as a success. But you've also advocated, as we discussed yesterday, that these jobs, these policies are applicable to other countries. And let me take issue with that and ask you to expand on the fact that, do you really think, isn't Germany a special case? Isn't there a specific type of dynamic economy that's creating jobs? A particular type of compact between the public and private sectors? And indeed, a particular level of skill among the population that is not readily applicable to many of the countries that we're discussing here, including India.
Yeah, this is a general challenge if academics approach real-world issues. Academics like to make things very simple, and they like to explain reality and provide solutions on a simple level. Reality strikes back by saying everything is different in my village, in another country, and in a different stage of development. I'm an academic. I'm interested in policy making. I'm advising policy making. But I also traveling around the world, and those who always start telling me it's special here, at the end it boils down to a few similar kinds of problems. I mean, it's everywhere true that the life of a person is most dramatically determined in the first 3 years. Yes, that's universal. So all our efforts to create a work-related, active life for a person starts in kindergarten, if you have kindergarten, or in other formal or informal relationships, cultural settings around the world. We have a certain chance, not so much chance anymore, if people are, let's say, 20s, 30s, if they're in the age where you can become a youth unemployed, yes? And we have no chance after 40, and it's universal, I think. So our efforts to do something have to be exactly there where we are, with the young. And that's my first point. Now, already, I mean, formality, informality, yes? We think this is an issue of the developing world, informality. But the developed world becomes more or less informal. This is true in the United States, this is true in Europe. Less and less is regulated and structured. That's a tendency. Also, 50% unemployment rate, if you would have told me 50% unemployment rate, and if you would ask me for countries, I would normally have said, well, yeah, I go to one of these developing countries that has lots of unemployment. But, well, the statistics are not so high, for reasons we know, because people are hiding in the informal sector. But in principle, there are people who have no hope and so on. And so we have 50% in developed countries. So there is youth unemployment at a very large level. So we have very similar problems. Now, the solution to those issues are, I think, also kind of global. We know that we need, I mean, people have to be taken care of. We need some social integration of individuals. This is part of society, or part of education, or part of families, or of different types of culture. Around the world, there are different kinds of settings doing this. We need some basic core education. We need people who need to read and write, for instance. That's very important. But as a footnote, a big problem in Germany is of kids who leave school and come to companies. They cannot read, they cannot write. This is Germany. We are talking about Germany. We're talking not about India, about Germany, or about Kenya, whatever. Employers complain that people who are coming cannot read and cannot write. And they have no social skills to integrate themselves in the labor market. These are the problems. And I don't think these challenges in principle are so distinctively different from between India and Germany. I mean, okay, of course the setting is different. I don't want to marginalize the problems of India, yes, but these are substantial. So this is very important to recognize. That's why training, general education is important, but there is a limit of general education, which is helpful. And this was already elaborated by Stefano. I don't want to go deeper in it. And he also already made the point that vocational training could be the way out. Now, what is the German model in a few sentences? The German model is to combine beyond school, additional general training provided at a kind of school, but a special school, with work in practice. So people really are sitting and working, and they're employed by a company, and they do something practical. So this is the combination. And the question is, of course, at the end they get a degree in a country where formal degrees are very important. This is very important. So a stamp 2/3 at least of a cohort has such a degree in Germany. They may have a university degree at the end too. They may have just high school, or they may have not even good schooling at the beginning. That's unique. So they have had some practical experience. So for the individual, that's interesting. Now the question is why companies provide that. This is expensive, yes, and that's also one of the reasons why maybe it's not adapted easily over time. It's not that some dictator or some government or some parliament has once decided we want to have that. It was coming out of industry historically, of the companies, of the guilds, of the professions who have said we need that in our interest. We invest in us. Okay, now what is the advantage? One is information. You get information about the people you have. So it's kind of a filter. And of course, in a more regulated setting of the labor market, it's more interesting. If you cannot fire a person when you hire him young, yes, you have him for life or her, then it might be useful to have this person for training purpose for 3 years on a low salary, maybe even nearly nothing, yes, and you can check. The other is, of course, country-specific knowledge, firm-specific knowledge. The company must have, if there's no firm-specific knowledge, there is no big argument for that. But the more it's important for a company to have firm-specific knowledge, and the better it is. Now, that's why in its own interest, at least German companies do that. And on top of that is, of course, culture. There is a long tradition. This is not easy transferable, of course, but you have to start with it, then you get it. And you have also a lot of institutional settings which have been developed. So there's a lot of social pressure also on the companies. Nowadays all countries around the world have to demonstrate that they are green, yes, that they're green jobs, or they have no child labor or whatever. Now some companies want to demonstrate they do something for the young, or for females, or for ethnic diversity. So that's, I mean, nothing special. I mean, this is part of a universal strategy of companies. If you care about ethnic diversity or about gender or about child labor, why shouldn't you care about, so the social responsibility to train young people? So certainly that's part of a package. That's why I don't understand why people think it's not transferable, because this is part of a package of issues companies have. Now, my third point I would like to make. So certainly it's very successful. Internally in Germany, it's criticized. It's not effective enough. It's not. We are not adjusting the hundreds of different types of curricula all the time, and so. But this is a high, luxury debate which we have. The basic principles are right. Now the question is if it's transferable to from Germany to Italy. Well, in Italy there's also lots of informal economy. Maybe that's the problem. I don't think so. However, I mean, maybe why not to France or to Spain and so on. I can explain this state-wise if you want. We have done some research on that. But the most important question is, and then I stop. The most important question is why is it so? Why is it so complicated to introduce it to the informal sector? Yes. Okay. First, it's about a formal degree. And well, then you first in Germany, yes. So no, but nevertheless, we know there's also vocational training in the informal sector. India, so far, but these numbers are completely wrong. Probably the chief statistician will say, but 8% of all people who are in the workforce, 8% have a kind of vocational training, and 50-50 of that is vocational and informal and informal. Maybe you have better numbers, but so there is. And now, what we of course need to push more for that, we have to mobilize societal initiatives for the informal sector. We have to involve family business and local networks. We need to involve churches. We make to have other non-profit organizations who want to engage in it. And we may use or misuse large employers or formal training centers to push for it. And we might want to provide as a official skill testing. If you come out of that thing, yes, and you get a stamp, you can prove that you do certain things, and you can get a degree, and maybe then get from there easier to the formal sector if you develop. So there are many ways to expand, and maybe I should stop here.
Thank you, Klaus. I want to, as I promised, have Mrs. Sen actually start us off on being, as Professor Sen said, being the argumentative Indian. So, you've heard three visions of where the sorts of policies that we should have for youth employment. We're talking about not just vocational skills that both Stefano and Klaus talked about, different ways, but Stefano's emphasis, for example, on soft skills, right? The idea that it is both sorts of things that you need. It's not just that you know how to be a carpenter, but you know how to show up for work, that you know how to actually behave if there's a problem. So those are values. And Professor Deshpande's view that really affirmative action in some ways is an important part of the toolkit, because many of the people accessed by such programs will not be able to actually have a share in society that the society should rightfully give them. The question I want to ask you, though, is slightly different. It's about practicality. As a policymaker, you've been fielding such ideas, and you've had several of your own, I know, over your long and distinguished career. How many of them actually work? How many of them get translated practice? Why? So can you take your reflections there?
Well, you know, frankly, this is an area where, and you're quite right, I've been at it for a while, where there are many more opinions than there are, you know, solid, well-researched, what should I say, advice. Opinions are a dime a dozen, and we've been actually trying them out sequentially to no great effect. But let me try and sort of put this in a little bit of a context. You know, I've been, as I said, watching this for 30 years. And invariably, and not just in India, it's also in the developed countries, youth unemployment has consistently been something like 3 to 4 times the general unemployment consistently. What is also consistent is over time that youth does get employed. Because eventually it's coming down to that 4-5% unemployment rate. Although it starts off youth employment at 16%, 15%, 16%. Somebody surely should have been asking the question, what happens between then, when he's young and when he's not so young? What is the transition that makes him employable? To date, I have not seen any work on that. Now, as a policy maker, the first question that comes to you, what happened? And it's not a very long window. We're talking about maybe somewhere between 5 to 10 years. What happened? As a statistician, the only way you're going to be able to get an answer to that question is if you actually do long-term longitudinal surveys. We all do longitudinal surveys, but we never ask the questions on employment and employability. Never. Now, if this is the number one problem, and again, this is not new. We've had this problem on our hands since the late 70s, since the second oil price shock. Right? So we've been hanging around for nigh on 30 years, and we haven't got down to the basic data that you need to be able to answer much of this. So now if you ask me as a policy maker, what is it that works, what is it that doesn't work? We said, you know, if we're doing hit and miss, if we are going by opinions, going by preconceived notions, you know, you're really looking at very small probabilities of success, which is where we pretty much are even today. However, there I think are a couple of issues which we really do need to take into account. And that is, and I'm being very specific in the Indian context. As was very rightly pointed out, we do have a very, very large informal sector, but to be more exact, it's the unorganized sector. Unorganized sector does not necessarily mean that they are either poor quality jobs or the productivity is low. It's a very diverse sector, and the data on that is pretty clear. The real issue out here is that we do have a skill development process that happens. It doesn't get reflected in the NSS surveys because the question that is asked is wrong. Right? What we also do know, and this is from the surveys of the corporates in India, that they're sourcing their labor from the unorganized or the informal sector. So you have a informal sector which is in a sense acting as the training ground rather than a formal vocational training institution. Now there are large costs that are being borne. But think about what's happening. The difference between Germany and India is that in Germany the corporation is bearing the cost of the training. In India the corporation is passing that burden on to some little entrepreneur sitting in the boondocks. Okay? In a sense, I think that is what we really need to get at. That if this is the process that is happening, you can either say that I'm going to destroy this process, get the kids out of this sort of informal employment, put them into formal training programs, and then get somebody to pay for it. Or you say that, look, if this is something that's been happening, has been happening not too unsuccessfully, but there are dimensions that need to be brought in to improve the productivities, then we need to understand what's happening and to strengthen that. Unfortunately, that's the part of my knowledge base that is virtually non-existent.
Brilliant. Thank you. So now I know that the panel, and I already got an indication that Klaus is rearing to go, which is why I'm going to stop them. Take deep breaths. I want to open it up to the floor. So what I'll do is open up to the floor for a few questions or comments, and then turn it back to the panel to respond to both the questions and to each other. Okay. So, who would like to go first, or are you all absolutely intimidated by this fierce panel? Right. Sorry, just wait for the mic.
Stefano mentioned just a little bit in passing about the quality of education. Are we, to my knowledge, I may be wrong, in most of the European countries, the quality of education, as we know from the results of the PISA tests and TIMSS tests and the like, but in most of the developing countries, the quality of education as indicated by those tests are very poor. I would like him to evaluate about the quality of education in terms of youth unemployment in the European countries and in the developing countries. Thank you.
I'm Amit Sadhukhan from Ikriar. I have a couple of questions. First to Dr. Stefano, that you were talking about these high specializations. Then that means very countries are specialized in very specific sectors, which is giving not giving them the opportunity to diversify their markets for different sectors and employability. What is my my logic is that in a very complicated integrated world, okay, the possibility of diversifications, like suppose Italy is importing iPhone from China, it can't produce iPhone in Italy, okay? So high integrating world market is basically giving less scope for labor diversification. So is it possible in this, kind of employability, generating employment within a country for various sectors? Second question to Professor Klaus and Professor Sen, you are talking about side which is education, vocational training, and other kind of skill development, which is a supply side measure. Okay. Now, do you think that for example, Indian IT sector developed is not with when the boom in the IT sectors come out with the vocational training automatically, okay? So there was a demand side from the IT sector which gives you the opportunity, private engineering, college and vocational training come up without any government interventions, okay? So demand side factor actually gave the scope for the more kind of vocational training where you don't need the government incentives or kind of thing. Third point, I want to give one numbers which is from ILO. What is this unemployment situation right now? 1.1 billion people are in the workplace. Okay, are the working age population, which is 1/3 of the world working class population, that is 3.3 billion. Among these 1.1 billion, 900 people are employed and 200 people are employed but without decent wage, okay? And their projection is by 2020, 400 million people are joining in this group. So it's 500 million over all over the world. This is the kind of number of unemployment which is going to be coming up in coming days, and that is basically what would be the future of this unemployment if you consider the growth of the employability in terms of manufacturing absorption in the other sector. Thank you.
One last point from anyone?
Thank you. There was a couple of months ago an interesting article in The Economist, which I'm sure you have all read, which showed that several Asian countries are now at the stage where European countries were many years ago when they introduced social insurance systems. So my question is, can you say the same thing about Asian countries today with regards to vocational training that has so much been advertised now by Mrs. Scarpetta and Professor Zimmermann? And if so, what would countries have to do?
So let me turn back to the panel. I'll go in the same order, if I may. And just for fairness, so that we just have the same, you can respond to both each other's comments, but also to respond perhaps to the comments addressed at you. Stefano, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I can't agree more with Dr. Sen about the evidence. We have been dealing with very complex issues. I think evidence, data, comparable data is the essence of the matter. I think you made a very good point about how it is that youth unemployment is 2 to 3 times the adult unemployment. Obviously, these young people at some point become adults, and obviously the unemployment rate declines significantly. I think there is a cohort effect, but I take very much your point. There are some data for a number of countries that follow individual over time. Let me give you a few numbers there, because I think, again, I strongly believe on the evidence. In Italy, it takes, on average, 23 months to find a job, the first job. Most of the time, this is a temporary precarious job. It takes 44 months to get, on average, a more stable job, a job that potentially has some career prospect. I believe that this is a major loss of the investment in human capital. Another interesting thing, there are studies in the UK and in the US that have followed the cohort of young people who were so unlikely to enter the labor market in the 1780s, the first and second oil shock. 20 years later, these young people, no longer young obviously, had 8% lower wage and a lower probability of being employed. I think, again, another loss of potential human capital investment was made before. And this, I can tell you with evidence from a number of countries, can lead to a vicious circle in which by lowering the return to investment in education, you might lower the incentive to invest in education, and by lowering investment in education, you are lowering your potential for growth in your economy. So I think this is a fundamental thing. Maybe a couple of the points that were made. Data again. The quality of education, by all means. The PISA study now covers 80 countries, I think have been instrumental for individual countries to think through seriously about the education system. It's not just access to education, it's the quality of the education outcome. Huge difference across the board. Even what you think are homogeneous countries, they are not. Huge difference within the same country, across schools, across regions. So this is a way in which actually, and guess what? China has 3 provinces in the top 10 countries in terms of educational outcomes in the PISA survey. So it's not just advanced versus emerging economies. The point of specialization, I think, is a very complex one. I agree. I think we have to go beyond this idea that we can anticipate occupations. I don't think we have a clue. I think from what we have been discussing here in other conferences, the economy is evolving so rapidly that what matters is not what the occupation of tomorrow, but the competence that will be required in the jobs of tomorrow. So I think what we have to do is not only to focus on a few occupations, because these occupations are in the sector of tomorrow, but it's more to allow young people to learn how to learn. That's, in my view, is the essence of the point. So really allow them to continuously learning throughout their education, and certainly throughout their working experience. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, so since there were no questions on affirmative action, I'm assuming I convinced everybody that it has to be. No, so I'll just react to a program. I think it's a very important point about data. And several academics have been asking why we don't have panel data, and so I want to pose that question to you about why not. I mean, we really need panel data to be able to answer many such questions. And
nobody asked them.
Well, we do, but anyway. So that's. I just want to make one small point and hand over the mic to the next speaker. This thing about transition from school to work. So I did a study from 3 universities in Delhi, which followed these students for 2 years. So of course it was a small study, obviously didn't have the kind of, but these are 3 elite universities of India, and so by all standards, these students were extremely employable, and they were similarly employable. So these were people who had graduated from similar degrees. So but when we saw the pathways from the time that they graduated to the point that they actually got the job, the pathways of Dalit or low caste students were very different from the pathways of the upper caste students. So these are people who have the same skills, who have the same degrees, but somehow their networks are different, their worlds are different, and unfortunately these are from, even though these are from the very elite universities, they end up getting different kinds of jobs. Dalit students found the job much later, a job that they actually stayed with. They found the job much later than the upper caste students, and the average salary for Dalit, the jobs that Dalit got, was lower than the average salary that upper caste got. So when we are talking about skill development and labor markets, I think we need to understand that the transition from being educated to being employed, I think varies depending on which group you belong to. So back to my pet theme.
Yeah, let me also first start with data and encourage Professor Sen to engage and himself, and maybe we offer support. I mean, we can mobilize at least in the labor issue as ICA worldwide competence if you would like to foster ideas here, because in some countries we have more evidence. I'm not saying we have enough evidence. We also say somewhere start. We are simply starting. But there are, of course, in big countries like the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, for instance, there are panel surveys for up to 30 years. Yes, we can follow people over 30 years, not everybody, but and we can learn a lot. And ICA, for instance, has just started a few years ago a panel where we look into unemployment. So people who are fresh unemployed, including young people, what happens to them, what the labor office records data, but we follow them with our own services over time to find out what has worked and so on. So all the programs can be seriously evaluated, and there are also matched employer-employee surveys, which is another approach, where company data is merged with household data to learn more about the dynamics of employment behaviors. These are kind of important things we have to push. That's just one remark. And we know, of course, from the few evidence we have, that for the young people, what's very clear, if you become unemployed early or don't find a job early, this is a lifelong stigma. That's I think we can fairly say. Yes, the likelihood to become unemployed, you become employed over some time, but you get unemployed more likely than others if you had not had the chance for a job early. So that's why becoming unemployed is very bad issue. Now, another comment to the question: how can we foster vocational training in a setting where companies don't want to do it? Well, okay, some government spending is maybe money is scarce, of course, but training vouchers certainly is something what could, for instance, help if young people get a voucher and they can go to, then we could maybe can generate the demand for getting also vocational training. Maybe then company would engage to do that. Now, from the from the audience, we had a few questions. I don't want to elaborate all of them in detail, but just, continuing where Stefano ended with the PISA studies and all the information. What is very important also in all kinds of settings, but in particular the European setting, that this data now provides a basis for competition, because in the past, school quality was never an issue. Yes? And if we look into the data issue, we should look at it in terms of competition. The data should be available, and the consequences of differences in quality has to have consequences, so to speak. So people have the schooling education system has to have more responsibility. People have to be able to act and to compete with others. That's very important. Now, the invention from the ICRIA, the future of the labor market will be problematic, because we will have more and more people who are entering the low-skilled sector, particularly the young, yes? And those people face a strong decline in worldwide demand for their competence. So if you don't educate them, or if you cannot educate them, or if you cannot train them, there will be mass unemployment also in the future, which is unavoidable, which is a problem. Well, finally, there was Economist article. Well, I would. It would be nice to say that the developing world now should take vocational training as part of the package of social security measures or activities, social policies. Well, most of the countries in the world have not done it. It's not only the developing countries, it's also developed countries. The United States is as far and as far to vocational trainings than India, or maybe is India maybe more ahead, or let's say Australia and so on. So I think it's a different kind of challenge. It's a worldwide challenge. We have to debate. That's why it's going on at the moment worldwide. The debate. We have to just do more here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I know. I agree that there is some panel stuff, longitudinal stuff, which is available, but they don't really answer the questions that really I have, and it causes problems. But let me get to some of the issues that were raised by the other panelists, and then I'll come back to it, the audience. You know, as far as the whole issue of the social category to which you belong and your access to the job market, you know, as you rightly said, that you know, because the social networks are different, because the kind of educational establishments they've gone to are different, the family support systems are different, you're starting to get differential results coming out. The fact of the matter is that much of that you have to, in a sense, take as given and ask the question, what is it that you can do at a particular point where the state can, in fact, intervene? There are limits to the level to which the state can go down. So if the state actually intervenes at a particular point in time to try and make up, and it's really important to be able to determine what that point itself is. Okay? And that's not very clear. And this is again a part of the debate that's currently ongoing. You know, when we are talking about things like affirmative action, it's there in universities to some extent, in government jobs to some extent, and that's about it. But when you're talking about intervention to correct these problems, it would have to be done at a different level. And identifying that level and the nature of the intervention is really at the heart of correcting much of these kinds of problems. Okay, the second issue on the notion of vocational training, and particular vocational training as social insurance. The essential assumption that vocational training, the assumption that if you are trained, then getting a job is not a problem, I think is questionable. All right? Let's take the software sector that you talked about. You know, I was there at the birth. I was the economic advisor to the Ministry of Information Technology. The problem there was that the entire IT sector in India was a case of very highly skilled people doing very low skilled jobs. You were dumbing down some of the best minds in the country. Okay? It's not something we should be proud of. We did that for 15 years. Right? Why did we do it? That we can discuss. But the fact of it is no great trick if you're taking somebody who is qualified for X and making him do X minus something. So you're bringing him down to a much lower level of productivity. That's presumably not the model you're talking about or you're thinking about. But unfortunately, a lot of the things that we are doing in terms of our educational programming, not programs, or the programming of our educational system, essentially is driving in that direction. Which is, let's get this guy an undergraduate degree, maybe even give him a master's degree, and then tell him to go work as a shop floor lathe operator. But this is precisely what we are doing. So we are talking about now a vocational education program, a skill program across the country. The point is, who are you selling it to? The person to whom you're selling, what he says is that, look, I may be a lathe operator, but the probability of my getting a lathe operator's job is higher if I do a bachelor's in history than if I go to some vocational training center. This is the social response. So you're talking about a social response that has been conditioned by 50 years of experience. Now, how do you change that? And I think that's the issue that we really have to tackle.
Wonderful. The idea of a policy forum is actually not to come to conclusions. That there is this magic list of things that, as a result of just 3 or 4 hours discussion we have, the idea is to stimulate debate, stimulate thought, stimulate questioning, and stimulate hopefully some actions in some investigations, some ways. And certainly this panel has done that. So I want to really thank you, and also for thanking you for playing along with the game and being part of the entertainment part of the program, shall we say, that stands between you and lunch. But on a serious note, I think there are 3 or 4 themes that come out of it in terms of the directions that I do want to reflect back to us, ourselves and the panel. The one thing that came clearly out, and this is, I think, a problem not just, of course, for India, but for much of the world, including, I would posit, for many countries in Europe, is evidence-based policymaking. Dr. Sen, your first point. Somehow, social policies and labor market policies are where people feel that we can act by instinct. Because we are part of society, we were educated, we have jobs, therefore we feel that we know what the policy should be. And that is an endemic problem in every part of the world, including in the advanced countries. And I think the call for evidence-based policymaking, for asking the right questions, but then treating that evidence with respect, rather than slipping back to our predetermined biases, is an important call for policymaking. But then, the one part that we haven't discussed enough is evidence of a different kind. Not just from longitudinal surveys, not just from understanding what works in terms of individual behavior and individual outcomes, but program evaluation of the sort that has been done much less, I think, in countries like India than they have been in other parts of the world. Rigorous scientific evaluation with the courage, as I was saying in an earlier intervention, with the courage to acknowledge when the program isn't working, not to say that it's a failure, but to say that we can do better. And that somehow, and looking at the academics and policymakers in India, is a culture that I think India really needs to inculcate more of, to rigorously examine the wealth of experiments and programs that's going on right now in this country. The whole world is watching, but the whole world is not able to learn enough, I think, compared to, say, what we were able to learn in Latin America in terms of what works and what doesn't. And finally, I do want to, having had this exhortation, I want to get back to reality, that it is about society, it's about political economy. And I think some of the things that Professor Deshpande talked about, and indeed Professor Sen, Dr. Sen, you talked about in terms of actually the social mores that determine behavior. We as economists actually have incomplete modeling functions to really adapt to that. So as an old theorist, I made my models work so that I can solve the equations. And I think that sort of evidence, unfortunately, doesn't incorporate the complexity of what the two of you are talking about, and there's a lesson there as well. Eventually, though, I want to actually go back to this very important and unexpected, I would say, intervention by the Saudi Minister of Labor in the previous panel. Eventually, it is all about information being out there, data being out there, evidence being out there, analysis being out there, and then it is for the polity and the society to debate that and come to the model that fits, which may be the German model, or it may be something totally different, but we can't get there with any degree of certainty without having that information out there for debate, for decision, and for evidence that on which we base our policy. With that, thank you all for a very engaging discussion. A lot to think about and a lot to learn, but thank you so much to the panel and to all of you for being part of the process.